So today we're taking a look at a system that I am very excited to take a look at. This disgusting monstrosity here is a system that I built for a friend 8 years ago. And as you can see, it has been lovingly used within that time. And well, now that the system is being retired, I do want to take a look at it and see how it's held up, because this was a budget system that I put together. I think the grand total after tax might have been somewhere around 430, maybe 440 at most. It was an extremely budget build even for the time. And well, just by the outside, we could probably assume it's going to be kind of a disaster inside. So let's just get in there. My friend is an artist that works with clay, and I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of residue of a lot of that work in here. Ooh, okay, this thing is pretty dusty. Wow, okay, this is how old this thing is. It still has a hard drive in. Okay, so it's very dusty in here. Unfortunately, it's raining outside right now, so I can't really go outside and dust this thing off. That's unfortunate. Specs wise, I'm not really sure how much RAM we're talking about here. I'm pretty sure it's 16 gigabytes, but I'm not 100% sure. But it is a 450 watt power supply, bronze rated. It's an EVGA unit. I've used a ton of those. They seem reliable enough, and it's held up all of these years. Obviously, this is a very low power system though, because we are using a Intel Pentium G4560, so that is a dual core 4-thread CPU. I'm going to be very interested to see how that thing holds up nowadays. And graphics card wise, we are talking about a GTX 960 4 gigabytes. Now, even when this came out, the 900 series from NVIDIA was, I believe at that point, a generation old. But we were trying to keep the system within a certain price point, and this was a used deal that popped up. And well, I mean, the graphics card, as far as I know, to this day is still working. It's a Strix 960. It's the 4 gigabyte version. There was a 2 gigabyte version of this card, so I'm hoping the 4 gigabytes means that it's gonna hold up better in modern games, if any of them will even launch, that is. So I'm very curious to see, because this is one of those builds where it's really going for about as bare bones as you can get, and it's actually crazy the difference, because back then with this Pentium, you know, dual cores with 4 threads was something that was actually impressive at this price point. And now I could walk into Micro Center and for about 80 bucks walk out with a CPU that has 6 cores and 12 threads. So those 8 years have definitely led to some technological differences here. But since I can't clean this thing out right now, we're just gonna get this thing plugged in and take a look at what it's got going on. So as I'm booting into the system here, you can see just how much of a mess it is, how dusty and how caked it is. You can literally see my fingerprints on the graphics card when I unfortunately touched it earlier. And while I initially thought this had 16 gigabytes of RAM, it actually only has 8 gigabytes. And it has a 128 gigabyte SSD and a 1 terabyte hard drive, along with that Strix GTX 960 4 gigabyte, and of course that Pentium G4560. So very, very bare bones specs all around. I'm very curious to see what the performance is going to be like. So we're going to jump in and take a look at how it does in a few games. We're not going to do anything crazy. We're not going to throw anything super modern at it. Not because I don't want to, but mostly because with only 4 gigabytes of VRAM, this is not really going to be able to launch the vast majority of those titles. That being said, I also ran into another problem. I could not get a display out over HDMI. It only ever worked if I used DisplayPort, which means I'm not going to be able to do direct capture. But we're mostly going to focus on CapFrame X anyway. And as you can see here, with the first game that we're taking a look at, Counter-Strike 2, the performance was surprisingly decent. Considering that this was an update that came out and fundamentally changed the graphics of the game to the point where it became far more demanding, I was pretty surprised to see the result that we got here. The FPS average of 106 and 1% lows of 53, not exactly going to be a terrible experience, though of course those 0.1% lows of 39.1 let you know that it's not going to be a perfect experience. But if you're someone that built this as a budget PC all the way back then and you were playing Counter-Strike, you're still able to continue to play it even with its big graphical update. And that's pretty surprising considering how heavy Windows has gotten since then, though we are still using a Windows 10 system as opposed to Windows 11. Now, one that really surprised me when it ran at all was Marvel Rivals, and the reason I say that is because being an Unreal 5 engine game, I already had very low expectations. I was able to launch it though and play through one game, but every time I've tried to launch it since then, it tells me I'm out of RAM. So I don't know how I managed to get this one miracle run. This was at the medium graphics settings with FSR set to quality, and the FPS average was 37 with 1% lows of 3.4. So there was definitely some noticeable stutter, and according to CapFrameX, we were looking at about 11.5% stuttering happening throughout the entirety of a game, and that was the only game I was able to play. So it was kind of a miracle that this launched at all, and that's kind of a problem that I ran into in the vast majority of recent titles where they just kind of refuse to even launch. I was actually able to launch Expedition 33 though, which surprised me. And in the benchmark segment that I ran through, we were looking at an FPS average of 43 with 1% lows of 19, which honestly is not bad at all considering the age of the hardware. But we are running the game at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using TSR at the low settings, so visually speaking, the game looks like a disaster and you realistically could not play like this. But these numbers nonetheless are pretty impressive to me considering the age of the hardware, but I think it really just shows how impressive upscaling technology is, more so than anything else. I also ran the Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail benchmark, and this was using the standard desktop graphics settings, so that is effectively setting things to medium, and of course FSR is activated in a dynamic resolution scale type scenario. And well, here we end up with an FPS average of 65 with 1% lows of 34. This I'm pretty happy with for the type of game that this is, and considering that it got a recent graphics upgrade, I'm pretty happy with the results. This is exactly the type of game that this system was originally built to play, so the fact that it's able to keep up after all these years, if anything, just seems like a win to me. I always enjoy benchmarking Hitman 3 because it's personally a game that I play quite a bit, and because of that, it has a lot more relevancy to me when I see it running on any of these systems. And well, with the medium in-game graphics settings and using FSR at the quality preset, we do end up with an FPS average of 56 with 1% lows of 34. Not bad at all. Considering the age of the hardware and the fact that it had budget status, I'm pretty happy with the result that we're getting here, in all honesty, especially considering the fact that the CPU here is so underpowered. But at least according to CapFrameX in the built-in benchmark, we had 100% smoothness completely across the board. Like I said, I'm mostly testing titles that are more relevant to me than anything else, and of course titles that are relevant to the main reason the system was built in the first place. And well, Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord is one of those titles that I always love testing because I'm always playing it. I'm currently playing through a campaign of this right now. And well, with an FPS average of 54 and 1% lows of 23, this was a pretty great result. There was one section where there was some pretty major stutter, but throughout most of the benchmark it was perfectly fine, and this is at the medium graphics settings, and I think that medium is really the sweet spot because you get really the biggest uplift in terms of the visual quality, where it goes from looking like Warband to looking like a brand new game, and anything past it has severe diminishing returns. So as long as you can hit medium, you're gonna have a great time, and this is a more or less decent experience, though do keep in mind that in the late game you're likely to run into quite a bit of problems. Of course, another title that I had to test is Overwatch, and specifically Overwatch 2. See, this system was originally made almost exclusively to play Overwatch. That was the game that my friend was obsessed with playing back in the day. And besides the occasional League of Legends or Hearthstone game, not much else has been needed. So Overwatch was essentially the game it was meant to play. And with the original Overwatch at this point no longer existing and instead getting updated to Overwatch 2, that of course, similar to Counter-Strike 2, came with some graphical upgrades. But luckily that seems to not have affected anything in the performance here. We did have one section where there was some pretty severe stutter, but the rest of the game was perfectly fine, and with an FPS average of 137 and 1% lows of 36, it's going to be pretty playable, though it's not going to be perfect. Obviously that major stutter ended up bringing down our 1% lows pretty significantly, and you can see that our 0.2 percentiles at 42 pretty much mean that it's going to be a relatively decent experience. And of course, with only 1.8% of the experience stuttering, it's gonna be a pretty great time. So the system is still able to keep up with what it originally was built to do, and considering that's 8 years of updates to Overwatch, with a major asterisk to that obviously, it's still pretty impressive. Another title that was pretty big back in the day when we put this system together was Rainbow Six Siege, and since then it has received quite a lot of updates. And though its big graphical update isn't coming out until a few months from now, we can still test out the performance of it, and we can see that with an FPS average of 74 and 1% lows of 44, that's a pretty great result considering this is the medium graphics settings and we are using FSR. It's FSR 2.0 at the ultra quality preset. So 100% smoothness across the board and really great performance pretty much means that this esports title is still going to be more than playable almost a decade later. So another title that I really wanted to check out because it's really impressed me with just how well it performs is Sniper Elite Resistance. Here you can see running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and of course no upscaling because the game doesn't support upscaling. We get an FPS average of 72 and 1% lows of 41, and with 100% smoothness across the entire test run, this is a pretty incredible result, especially for a brand new title. Of course, it's not running on an updated engine, and in a lot of ways it's like the previous Sniper Elite title, but that doesn't really mean anything because the game is fun to play, and at the end of the day, video games are meant to be played, not just to look at them. But what does any of this really mean overall? Well, we can see here in aggregate of all of the games that we've tested, pretty much all except 2 of the titles were giving effectively a 60 FPS gaming average. Of course, there are a lot of asterisks to throw here. For one, Marvel Rivals. It didn't perform well and it won't launch anymore. Expedition 33, while it does launch and it doesn't give 60 FPS, you're also running the game at such a low quality that it looks hideous, and the difference between the pre-rendered cutscenes and the actual gameplay will be extremely jarring. And keep in mind that a lot of the titles that I'm testing here, I'm only testing because there were a lot of titles that did not launch on this system because of obvious reasons. That 4 GB video memory limit pretty much keeps us from trying to play any AAA title that came out in the last couple of years. So I tried to stick to mostly titles that I would care about playing, or esports titles that were effectively what this was designed to play anyway. And considering it gave the best performance in Overwatch, which is the title that the whole system was meant to play, I think it's still a great result, and it shows that there was a lot of value for money to come out of this system. If my friend was still playing Overwatch, they'd still be able to get a high refresh rate experience. In fact, they were being held back by the refresh rate of their display because it was only a 1080p 60 hertz display. So there was still headroom left for them with this system, but obviously they don't game anymore, so there's no reason to have this big monstrosity, and they're going to be switching over to a mini PC. But in fact, let me show you an example of just how much headroom there was left with Overwatch. If we look at the sensor data, and this is something we didn't even really cover, but you'll see that the CPU load on average throughout the entirety of a game was 91% on the CPU. Meanwhile, on the GPU, 64%. That means we were CPU limited in this scenario, which means that if we took this graphics card and put it into a better system, better CPU, we would actually see better performance performance in Overwatch. Of course, this wasn't true in all titles. You can see in Mountain Blade Bannerlord that the GPU load most of the time was 94%, effectively meaning that we were fully GPU bound throughout the entirety of the benchmark. But you'll see here in Counter-Strike 2, average GPU load 69%. So again, CPU bound scenario. So that 960 does still have some horsepower left for playing some of the most popular titles in the world today, still almost a decade later. It's really just that G4560 that's been holding it back. Well, that and the fact that it only has 4 gigabytes of VRAM. So I'm definitely going to mess around with this GPU a bit more. I want to see what I could get to play on there and see just in general how it holds up today. I might slap it into a higher end system. But moving on specifically to the CPU, the Intel Pentium G4560 in Cinebench R23 ends up scoring 2011 for the multi-core score. That makes it one of the lowest, the second lowest scoring CPU in my charts here. That puts it in company with the Ryzen 3 3200U, and that was a version with a TDP of around 10 watts. So a chip like the Intel N100 ends up scoring 600 points more than this Pentium. Of course, if we look at the single core performance, then it starts to move up in the charts, where now it's beating out the Ryzen 3 3200U, and it closes the gap on the N100, though there's still a pretty noticeable one there. And it essentially falls behind chips like the Ryzen 7 2700U and the Ryzen 5 3500U. So it falls behind even first gen Ryzen processors. Not exactly a great result there. I also ran for fun just the Civilization turn time test, and that ended up giving me an average turn time of 70.28 seconds. Over a minute for each turn in the late game. That's going to be pretty disastrous. Well, there you have it. We have taken a look at the system running on a few games. Again, it wasn't any heavy titles because those heavy titles don't even open on this system. Things like Spider-Man Remastered and all of the other versions like Miles Morales or even Spider-Man 2, they just didn't launch at all. None of the Horizon games launched either. Ghost of Tsushima also failed to launch. Really, there was just so many games that did not work on the system. But it did a great job in a lot of those original esports titles that it was intended to run. And considering that it was less than $500 and it's been almost a decade later, I think that the value for money here has been pretty astronomical. Of course, there were certain decisions that I made at the time that if there was a little bit more money in the budget, it would have made this a far better system. You know, at this time, if we had gone with even a budget first gen Ryzen system, we would have an upgrade path right now towards a 16 core processor or an 8 core with X3D. We also could have had a graphics card with more video memory if we had gone with something like a GTX 1060. But again, a very restricted budget kind of just forced us down this route, and still after all these years it holds up really well in a wide variety of games. In fact, I sat down and I played Repo with my friends on here on my 1440p display. Now it wasn't my ultra wide, but it was a 1440p display, and I had everything cranked up to the max, and well, there was definitely some infrequent stutter here and there. It definitely wasn't a perfect experience, but I was able to play the game with my friends. And if this was the only way that I could game, I would happily play like this, because that's what I did when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, I didn't have the best computer ever. I was playing the original Star Wars Battlefront. I'm talking the one from like 2002. That original Battlefront, I was playing that at 15 frames per second, having a blast. So the fact that I could boot up a brand new title on here and get a decent enough frame rate that I can happily play without any real issues, this is a win to me. For $500, this really was a great value for my friend, and in all honesty, it kind of just reinforces the fact that the budget end of the market is effectively dead at this point because price points have gotten so ridiculous. But anyways, I'll catch you guys in the next one where we're likely to take this graphics card and try it out on its own.